Last lecture, we talked about the amazing and effortless way infants acquire a first language. Learning a second language, though, feels anything but effortless. Why might this be? Why is learning a second language so much harder than learning our native tongue? In this lecture, we will consider this question from a couple of angles. First, we're going to look at whether and how other species have been able to learn human language systems, or things very like human language. Second, we'll look at humans learning a second language. We'll look at how that is both like and unlike the case of babies learning a first language, on the one hand, and how it is like and unlike animals learning an alien way of communicating, on the other. So, can other species learn human language, and if so, how? These are important questions for us because how other animals learn a language suggests something about how languages might be learned by us, and it also forces us to think about what it means to have language. Remember that some of the ways we learn languages as babies have to do with general abilities to monitor statistical relations in our perceptual experiences. Our ability to track which sounds go together often and which sounds almost never go together, for example. And we actually share those abilities to track statistical properties of our perceptual experience with other species. Now, in considering other animals, we're going to begin by looking at primates because we share so much of our genetic heritage with them. And because of this, we won't begin with speech, which requires some special properties of the vocal tract that most other species don't share with humans. And in fact, this is actually why we're vulnerable to choking on our food. The anatomy that lets us make so many different sounds is also the anatomy that kind of screws up and combines eating and breathing in ways that allow choking to happen. So, we're not really talking about language here. We're actually talking about acquiring symbol systems, sign languages, modified, or other artificial systems for communication by using computer keyboards and sets of symbols, for example. Now, apes that use these systems have been trained in one of two ways. In one way, as with many of the early studies on Coco the gorilla and Lucy the chimpanzee, the animals are trained using rewards, using operant conditioning, to link symbols like signs or pictograms, kind of stylized pictures, with objects. So the apes are shown a picture of a dog and given the sign or the symbol that means dog in their false language, and then they're asked to generate that symbol for dog whenever they're shown the image. If they get that right, they'll get some kind of treat. With this approach, training begins relatively late in the ape's childhood, and training happens exclusively between the ape and other human beings. Now, in a second way, and this is the way employed by Sue Savage-Rumbaugh and her colleagues, animals are exposed to symbolic communication early in their lives, and they learn alongside their mother, for example. And in this case, apes actually appear to have more sophisticated skills and to use symbols with each other as well as with other humans. But to say that apes acquire some symbols and use them doesn't really answer the question of how well they do. Now, thinking back, we talked about how babies acquire a vocabulary or a lexicon that ends in adulthood at some 60,000 words or so. Now, with extensive training, apes acquire up to 500 distinct symbols, but they don't have the kind of takeoff that happens for younger kids, and their acquisition is certainly not so effortless. It doesn't happen automatically. It requires fairly intense training efforts from human caregivers. Now, we also talked about the rules of combining words to form complex thoughts and ideas, grammar and syntax. This also seems absent in animals that have been trained with symbol systems. It's rare for them to combine more than two symbols, and the combinations they make are sort of simple and constrained. Further, some studies show that more than 90% of the communication these trained apes engage in with their human caregivers is in the form of imperatives. That is, once animals acquire speech-like capacity, they use that capacity to get what they want. Give me banana, give me a hug, and so on. But apes generally don't use their communication abilities to do more than that. Now, in fact, although there is some significant disagreement about the nature of animals' achievements in language, researchers have observed that humans use language to represent their thoughts and to communicate about those thoughts, and apes largely use language to communicate their desires. Now, of course, language studies with animals have not been done only with apes. So let's consider now some work on parrots too. And here recall that parrots can actually be taught to speak. So Alex the parrot, an African gray parrot, was taught to speak by a researcher named Irene Pepperberg. And they used a very interesting technique that is different than the techniques used with primates. In this approach, while Alex watches, two human beings interact around an object that Alex has already shown some interest in or some curiosity about. So one human might show the object to the other human and say, "What is here? What color? What shape?" The human model then responds to the questions. Now, the human model gets praised when they give a correct answer, and they receive disapproval when they give an incorrect response. And that's especially true when they give an incorrect response that's a lot like whatever Alex is making at the time in response to those questions. And what is disapproval? Well, disapproval is scolding, removing the item from the sight of the human model, and sometimes the human model is asked to try again. Now, as you can see, this is a real contrast to studies with apes, and it's particularly a contrast to those early ones in some ways. As Pepperberg argues, when you reward correct answers with foods, as in the early approaches with apes, that's confusing. The apes heard, "What is this?" They said cork, and they got a banana. With her method, the right word gets you the object, so you can use language to get things you have requested in a more direct way, as is the case with human children. And with this kind of clever method, which is more like some aspects of human children's experience, how far does Alex get? Alex can make requests, he can label 50 different objects, he can identify shapes, colors, and quantities. But again, Alex doesn't use language like human children. And although his experiences were in some respects more like those of human children, they still were more intensively focused on training language, using operant conditioning-like principles. And that's not the effortless acquisition that we see in our own infants. However, these methods are worth looking at because they're a bit more analogous to the methods that we sometimes use to acquire a second language later in our childhoods or as adults. And they're a bit more disappointing in their outcomes, which to some extent may also be true for our efforts to learn second languages. So let's turn our attention now to human adult second language learners. Are we as bad as animals with as much effort? And if so, why would that be? And even animals appear to be better off when their language training starts very early in their lives. So is there something unique about language acquisition and babies? Now, this is a more specific version of the same idea we considered a couple lectures back. Is there a critical period or a sensitive period for learning language? And is that why learning a second language as an adult is so much more difficult than learning a first? Well, evidence for a critical period would need to go something like this. If you don't get early exposure to that second language, you can never achieve native-like capabilities in speaking or using that language. Let's get the bad news over quickly. It turns out this is true. Now, to look at this issue, researchers Hyltenstam and Abrahamsson recruited second language speakers of Swedish into their laboratories. And they were particularly interested in people who had been speaking Swedish for decades, living immersed in Swedish culture, and who were routinely mistaken for native speakers by other native speakers of Swedish. They presented these people with a series of very difficult language tasks, including what is called a grammaticality judgment test. To give you some perspective on this test, judging the grammatical correctness of a sentence can vary from what is expected for most competent speakers of a language to very difficult and subtle judgments that are made accurately only by a highly proficient speaker. What they found with this sample of people who were clearly very good at speaking Swedish is that under extreme circumstances generated in their laboratory, native speakers and the second language Swedish speakers were different. Along with evidence from case studies of children reared without language exposure, whose adult attainment of language is never quite normal, this work and other work really suggests that there is some kind of biological constraint on acquiring or learning a second language. But an alternative way to think about this work is this. This work also shows that it is possible for adult onset learners to get virtually native competence, so much so that they can only be distinguished from native speakers in a very tough laboratory-based language challenge. Now, the near-native competence of these research participants is, of course, not typical. And for the most part, researchers acknowledge that adults' second language acquisition is difficult. It produces a lot of variability between people. Some people get very good, others don't. And on average, second language acquisition has poor outcomes, at least if the standard for comparison is a native speaker. Well, why is this? So recall that in the last lecture, we noted two ways in which our native language changes us, in terms of phonemes we can distinguish, and in terms of concepts or categories that we emphasize or de-emphasize in the way we think about the world. Now, we focused on a physical category, tight or loose fitting, and it was easy to get that category back when adults were asked to focus on it. But other categories may not be so easily rebuilt. For example, many languages mark nouns by gender so that there are male nouns and female nouns, and in German even neutral nouns. English doesn't do this. And it may be quite difficult to reacquire this conceptual category system if you did not develop it in infancy and early childhood. Other ways that our native language changes us were also mentioned last time. We begin to use stress and intonation patterns to decode speech from early on, and those patterns are not the same from language to language. Native English speakers, as we noted, use stress to segment utterances and words in English. Our words are typically stressed on the first syllable as opposed to syllable. So this is a good way to figure out where words start in English. It's a good strategy. English speakers exploit it as infants. But if you then learn a new language that doesn't segment using stress in that way, that strategy is going to hurt you. A different way to think about this is that cues are located in the speech stream, but the segmentation of that stream is something that happens in the person who is speaking and using the language. And sometimes these two are mismatched, and that's more likely for second language learners. Can you train people to recognize phonemes, the smallest sound units in a language, that they don't need to distinguish in their native language? Attempts to do this have not been successful, although this is an area of active research today. The incidental learning of words that we also seemed able to do as children doesn't always happen with second languages either. And there, it appears that sometimes we need to be more intentional in order to acquire new vocabulary. So in one study, for example, participants were asked to read a passage in the second language, and some participants were asked to make special note of the vocabulary words in the passage, and others read just for comprehension. And in this case, intentional vocabulary study led to better learning of the vocabulary words, as indicated by better performance on a later test. But learning a second language is a goal for many adults and others beyond early childhood, despite all this negative news. And there are obvious reasons why it's useful to be able to speak other languages. These include travel, but they also include required foreign language learning in schools, especially in high school and college years. They include the ability to read books and poetry in their original and untranslated versions. And they even include the capacity to know a broader range of world news than is on offer in our own language. And that's not even to mention careers as translators in anthropology or classics or any field involving cross-cultural work and so on. There are many, many good reasons to learn a second language. And finally, and this is something we'll actually return to in more detail later, speaking a second language appears to give us some benefits during later life by protecting us from cognitive declines that occur in aging. So, given all that, what if you miss the boat on the critical period? How can you fulfill your adult dream to learn Spanish or German or Mandarin Chinese? Many general learning principles apply to learning languages. Engage with the material deeply, use elaborative encoding. Remember, this means linking new material to things we already know to enhance our ability to learn and remember the new information. But here, let's consider some special features of languages that will give you a few more helpful ideas for learning a second one. The first important technique is to find a way to what is called immersion, being immersed in that language. One major predictor of second language learning outcomes, of how well people learn that second language, has to do with where people do the learning. Let me give you a personal example. I grew up in the United States. I learned French in school off and on for several years in 2 different states. I probably spent up to 6 or 7 years taking French classes in school, beginning at the age of 6 or so. Now, despite all this early exposure and the fact that I'm a fairly diligent and competent student, I was never able to use French effectively to communicate. By contrast, I spent approximately 8 months in formal German instruction. But here's the key difference. I was living in Berlin, Germany at the time, and although my work language was English, I had substantial immersion in German language and culture. I lived in Berlin for 3 years, and while I would never have been mistaken for a native speaker, I was able to read the major newspapers, to engage in random conversation with people, including on more substantive topics than weather, and I was able to read relatively straightforward novels. And the difference in these 2 experiences was immersion. Other research suggests that where you're learning may be relatively unrelated to your acquisition of grammar. That is, people are equally good at learning the grammar of a new language, regardless of whether they learn in their home country or in the second language country. But learning in country appears to really improve your lexicon, your vocabulary, and your grasp of the pragmatics of a second language. And the pragmatics means what you say when, politeness phrases, how to say things appropriately versus inappropriately, slang, and other kinds of nuances of how a language gets used. So, what is it that makes the difference between immersion and learning from the safety of home? There are at least 2 major reasons why immersion is better. Now, one is simply exposure. Sheer exposure to language is much greater if you're immersed in the country where you're trying to learn the language than if you're at home and taking an occasional class. The second difference is that issue of purpose. When learning a second language in one's home country, the language is never critical for living except in the context of the classroom. But in a foreign country, the language is required for negotiating everyday life. And this can make acquisition feel not quite effortless, but quicker and more efficient than learning in the classroom. In addition to immersion, a second thing you want to do is to choose the language you're going to learn carefully. Now, rumor had it when I was in high school that Spanish was an easy language, German was a difficult one, and French was somewhere in between. Is this true? Well, sort of. As it happens, the issue is not in the specific language, but rather it's in the distance between your native language and the one you're trying to learn. And studies suggest that the bigger that distance between your native tongue and your second language, the slower you are to learn the second language, the harder it is to acquire that second language, and the worse you're doing at the same time point compared to those learning a language closer to their own. In other words, it's going to take you longer to get the same level of ability. Now, what makes for linguistic distance? Well, interestingly, there are many ways to go about determining this. So one is to consider the origins of different languages in a kind of language family tree. For example, the Romance languages have evolved historically from Latin, and both the Romance and Germanic languages have common roots, along with some other languages, in what is called the Indo-European language family. So the idea here is that languages that are closer together historically ought to be easier to learn, so English speakers should have an easier time with, say, German than with Tamil. But there could be other ways of thinking about language distance. Another way to think about it is to look at a 200-item database of basic high-frequency words in about 84 languages and dialects. And this database was developed by Dyen and colleagues. And based on this database, you can figure out whether two languages share more or fewer of these high-frequency words. And these are words like milk, mother, tree. They're words that nearly every language needs. A researcher named van der Slik examined how these two measures of language distance fared in predicting language learning outcomes. And he did this by looking at learning of Dutch by people who had a variety of different native languages. And Dutch is a really nice language to study, by the way, because unlike English, it is very possible to grow to adulthood with no exposure to Dutch until you actually start to learn it. By contrast, English is so ubiquitous in the world that it's actually hard to know when people began being exposed to English, and it makes it very difficult to figure out how long people have been learning or experiencing English. So they did this in the Netherlands, and to look at linguistic distance, they examined the results of a set of exams that are given to migrants who want to go to college in the Netherlands. And the exams test speaking, writing, reading, and listening in Dutch, and they do so all separately. But van der Slik focused on speaking and writing, and this is expressive language, and it's usually a little bit harder than listening and reading. So the tasks on the test are things like responding to questions. So for example, people might be asked, what is your opinion about advertising on TV? So this is testing your ability to express yourself in an everyday context. People might be asked to give instructions, to complain. That's my favorite. Telling a story, to write about something you've read, and so on. So judges evaluate people's responses, and the emphasis of the evaluation is functional proficiency. So it's not important that participants get it perfect, it's that they are able to communicate effectively. Content is more important than form. Now, because the same test is given to many different migrants from many different language communities, this permits a very nice test of the role of linguistic distance in people's language proficiency. So van der Slik also looked at the age of arrival in the Netherlands, the length of time people had lived there, the number of hours per week that they studied Dutch, and their prior educational history. And what he found was that the distance between Dutch and the native tongue predicted how well people did on the exams, and the closer the native tongue, the better the exam performance. A third important thing is to be lucky in language capacity. Differences between people and how well they learn a second language aren't just a function of who gets immersion and who spends more time and effort. There are real individual differences in language learning capacity. Studies of twins suggest this ability is highly heritable. So if you think, as I do, that language abilities run in your family, or if you think they don't, you're also likely to be right about that to some extent. Now, this is not a reason to avoid learning a second language. It's more a reason to adjust your expectations a bit about two things, about how competent you will get in a new language, and about how much effort you will have to spend. So think about all those Europeans who can speak English. Some are fast, some are slow, some are accented, some are really fluent. But if so many people can learn our language well enough to communicate, nearly all of us should be able to learn enough of a second language to function, even if we aren't going to be mistaken for a native speaker. Before we turn to the last topic of this lecture, let's revisit the continuum of language learning from babies, effortless and perfect, to other species, highly effortful and pretty poor outcomes. Second language learning by adult humans is somewhere in the middle. Unlike other species, we can actually, given the right situation and good luck on genetically based aspects of ability and some hard work, get pretty close to perfect. But, like other species, we may not be able to learn in quite the same way as we once did. We may need more explicit, deliberate learning strategies. And there are going to be some limits to how perfectly we can learn based on our native language. The exception to this rule is learning a second language during the critical period, in early childhood. In that case, people have a chance to really be truly bilingual, proficient in two languages. Many of my cousins have this type of fluency in both Tamil, my family's native tongue, and Hindi, and they nearly have that level of capability in English as well. But the issue of being bilingual raises a common concern about language learning, and that's the idea that if we learn two languages, we'll somehow be behind in both or will be adversely affected in one of our languages by virtue of learning the second. For many of you in this course, the concern may not be about yourselves, but about children or grandchildren. Well, first, there's no reason to worry about this for children, and there's every reason to encourage bilingual experience in childhood however you can. And we'll return to that a little bit later in our course when we discuss how you can enhance some of the basic cognitive capabilities that actually support learning broadly in all kinds of areas. But second, let's consider this point with second language learning in adulthood. Does learning a second language actually mess up your first? Well, there's this interesting way in which it actually has to do so, at least temporarily, when you're initially learning that second language. Now, consider how this might work just for a moment. When you learn a new word in a foreign language, let's say we're learning German, so we learn that in German, a dog is ein Hund. Now we have a bunch of associations we have acquired over our lifetimes, including one between our native term for dog, and now our new German term, Hund. Now suppose we're walking down the street in Berlin and there's a dog. In order to correctly use the German word, Hund, you have to actually inhibit your much faster and better learned response, which is dog. And in fact, the better you are at suppressing dog, the better you'll be able to learn to say Hund while in Berlin. But the effect is temporary. Once you learn Hund very, very well, you don't need to be as worried about suppressing dog. And this is precisely what Levy and colleagues found in a recent study of Americans learning Spanish vocabulary. If participants were asked to repeatedly name objects in Spanish, that temporarily slowed down their ability to access those names in English. And this effect was most strongly found for the people whose Spanish was much weaker than their English. Those were the people who really had to push their English vocabulary down in order to get the Spanish vocabulary correct. Now, in this particular case, these were American students and they were located in the US, and the inhibition effects of learning a second language were temporary. The important take-home point here is that operating in two languages involves the ability to inhibit competing responses. If you want to use one language, you need to be able to push away the vocabulary and words of the other language. And the more languages, the more potential competing responses you have. Now, of course, the more languages you have, it's also the case that you have more experience and more possibilities to link prior knowledge to new vocabulary and grammar. Now, research is suggesting that that capacity to inhibit responses in general gets strengthened when we consistently have to operate in more than one language. And improved inhibition is something that can help our learning much more broadly in all kinds of other areas. And we are going to return to this aspect of language learning later in the course. For now, this is just something to add to the list of all those good reasons to learn a second language. Learning a second language is effortful, and it's difficult in part because of the way in which a brain tuned to our native language misses important information in the new language, and it makes it hard to acquire particular sounds, concepts, and grammatical structures in that new language. This difficulty means that in second language learning, we have to employ more deliberate and effortful strategies to achieve mastery of that language. Having said that, however, we're far from being as badly off as non-human species, and the ceiling on our second language acquisition, while maybe lower than the ceiling for our first language, is still pretty high up. In the next part of the course, we'll be focusing on the what of learning. We'll look at different types of learning with two broader distinctions in mind: the distinction between skills and knowledge, and the distinction between learning on purpose and learning incidentally. Language learning in childhood and adulthood are a kind of miniature version of those distinctions. In language learning, we learn both knowledge, we acquire vocabulary and grammatical rules, and we acquire skills, the motor ability to articulate new phonetic combinations, the capacity to use the right phrases and greetings, and the ability to speak and converse. And we learn both incidentally, as when we simply hear our native tongue and absorb words and phonemes, as well as deliberately when we sit down to study a set of vocabulary words in our second language. Virtually all learning combines skills and knowledge, but as we move through the next section of the course, we're going to move from an initial focus on skill acquisition to a more knowledge focus as we turn to think about learning in the areas of math and science. Further, as we go, We will consider both tacit forms of learning, that is, learning without words, like when we acquire an understanding of a space by moving around within it, and more deliberate forms of learning, as when we test out a theory about a math problem or study a map.